I'm gonna call the August meeting of the Benefits Cliff Task Force to order. Madam Secretary, please call the roll.
Senator Neal, Senator Nemes, present. Senator Wheeler, present. Representative Bray,
Present.
Representative Stevenson, Representative Weber,
Here.
Co-Chair Howell,
Here.
Co-Chair Dixon.
I believe we have a quorum. Do I have a motion to approve the July minutes? Motion has been seconded. No objection. Those are approved. We'd like to jump into this with Charles Hall with the Kentucky Chamber for the Benefits Cliff Community Perspective.
Thank you, Chair. Give me just 1 second here while I get this PowerPoint pulled up.
Take your time. I knew you'd how to do this. I didn't have to tell you how to introduce.
There we go. We're ready to roll. Well, good morning, everybody. My name is Charles Hall. I am the Executive Director of the Kentucky Chamber Center for Policy and Research. Thank you to the chairs of this task force for inviting us to give our perspective on this issue. I know time is of the essence today. You guys have a lot going on, so I'm going to try to be as brief as I possibly can. This presentation is going to fall into roughly 3 sections. I'm going to talk a little bit about how benefit cliffs affect employers and provide that business community perspective. I'm going to talk a little bit about policy solutions that you all might consider as you're working your way through this process. And then we'll talk a little bit about some of Kentucky's childcare challenges, again, from that business community perspective, because I know we have another panel coming up after this. They'll get into some of those issues. I do think the benefit cliff issue has some downward pressure on labor force participation. I'm not going to get into that in a whole lot of detail. I'm also not going to talk a whole lot about what a benefit cliff is, because I think the last meeting of this task force did a really good job of laying out how benefit cliffs work, the nature of those issues. What I really want to talk about with employers is specifically how this affects employers from a managerial perspective, but also from a couple of other different perspectives. There's really 2 primary ways in which we most often hear about benefit cliffs creating challenges for employers. One of those first ways involves when an employer offers a worker a wage increase of some sort. Last year, we spent some time traveling throughout the state, myself and some other chamber colleagues, and we were talking to employers about what are some of the workforce challenges that they had. And we actually surveyed employers on that question, and we listed out a whole bunch of different types of challenges that they might be facing: transportation issues, childcare issues, skills gaps, those types of things. And I remember there was one particular meeting we had out in the eastern part of the state where someone raised their hand and said, you left off a really important point. And that is the issue created by benefit cliffs and what happens when an individual runs into some sort of threshold that they surpass, and that creates issues for them when it comes to accessing benefits. And this employer in particular mentioned how throughout the course of the pandemic, they've steadily increased their wages to attract and retain more workers. And when they did a staff-wide pay increase, they actually had current staff come to them saying that, hey, this is actually going to create really significant problems. Can we not accept this pay increase? And as you can imagine, that employer was a bit taken back by that. So it's a very real experience they were having. Another way that we see this affecting employers is when it comes to offering an employee more hours or a transition from part-time employment to full-time employment. Again, I was talking to an employer just about a month and a half ago about this exact issue where they're having trouble finding workers. And so they have asked some of their part-time staff to consider transitioning to full-time. And the big barrier that they're finding when they make those requests is that jeopardizes, or at least perceives to jeopardize, access to various public assistance programs. There has been, I think, an increased frequency in hearing about these challenges from employers, and a lot of that has to do with some of the labor market tightness that we're experiencing right now. I want to talk a little bit about that just to put this into perspective and how this problem maybe ebbs and flows. This is a quick look at Kentucky's current workforce shortage. So this blue line here represents the number of job vacancies that are currently in Kentucky. So the number of jobs that are currently open as surveyed by employers. And then that red line shows you the number of unemployed individuals in Kentucky. And remember, that definition of an unemployed individual is someone who does not have work but is actively seeking work. So these are folks that are out there on the job market looking for jobs. Usually those 2 lines will kind of hover fairly close to each other. So you might have 1 open job for every unemployed worker. That's a fairly decent equilibrium for you to have. That means workers still have a lot of leverage in the labor market, but at the same time, employers can actually find workers to staff open positions. If you look at where we are right now, this is based on May 2022. We have quite a few more open jobs than we do people actively seeking jobs. Right now, it's over a 2-to-1 ratio. So there's more than 2 open jobs for every individual that is actively seeking a job at the moment in Kentucky. So that's putting a whole lot of labor market tightness into play. And employers are reacting to this in a whole bunch of different ways. But one of the key ways that they're reacting to this is by increasing wages and increasing salaries. There's all sorts of different ways we can look at wage increases. We could go over a ton of charts. This is a quick look at one way of looking at wage increases and how wages are increasing over time. This is the Employment Cost Index. This is a Bureau of Labor Statistics measure. Again, you can see a pretty obvious upward trend as we move into the second quarter of 2021, and that upward trend has just continued on and on. And so we're seeing a whole lot of wage increases and salary increases on the part of employers. The other thing that we're seeing is employers asking workers to work more. Particularly, we're seeing a whole lot of maybe part-time employees being asked to consider transitioning into near full-time or full-time itself. This is another Bureau of Labor Statistics measure that we can look at that tracks average weekly hours for all employees. This is not a number that moves around a whole lot. If I backed this out, say 10 years, you would see a pretty level around 34.5. The fact that this spiked all the way up to 35 suggests a whole lot of movement. Because again, this is a metric that doesn't move a whole lot. This is again reflective of things that we're hearing about in, say, employer surveys, which shows that one of the ways they're coping with labor force shortages is by asking current staff to work more. So again, kind of go back to those 2 challenges that I talked about when it comes to benefit cliff challenges for employers, increasing compensation, offering more hours. We're seeing more and more of this. It is a long-term issue. But again, I think when you have really tight labor markets, it becomes more prevalent than it normally is, even though it is a problem regardless of labor market tightness. So I want to talk briefly about a few different policy solutions for this task force to kick around as you all explore this issue in more detail. First of all, I want to point out House Bill 708, which was sponsored by Representative Dixon. I think that piece of legislation took a really important step forward in addressing some of these issues that we're talking about. I think oftentimes when an individual is receiving public assistance benefits, I imagine a lot of anxiety comes with that when things like wage increases come into play, more hours are offered, because there is that potential threat they could be losing really important benefits that they and their families depend on. We need to make sure, though, that those decisions are as fully informed as we possibly can. And I think benefit cliff calculators offer a really good way to do that. And one of the things that Representative Dixon's bill did is that it required the Cabinet for Health and Family Services to develop a proposal. So the bill doesn't require them to actually implement this benefit cliff calculator tool. Instead, it requires them to create a proposal. They will then bring that to you all, and you all can kind of have that conversation. I think that's a really smart way to go about doing this. There's a whole lot of benefit cliff calculator tools that are out there right now. You all learned about what I think is a really great one, the Family Resource Simulator offered by the Kentucky Center for Statistics. There's a whole lot of other ones. The Atlanta Fed has one called CLIF. It's an acronym, the Career Ladder Identifier and Financial Forecaster. The Georgia Center for Opportunity has a really good tool. National Center for Children in Poverty. I believe United Way, I think they offer types of tools. There's all sorts of different ones out there. What I want to emphasize, though, is that as the cabinet develops this proposal for offering a benefit cliff calculator, we need to make sure that it is a benefit cliff calculator that truly works for working families, but also employers. And kind of pull in my own personal experiences to talk a little bit about this. You know, the household that I was raised in, my dad worked more than full time at managing a local hardware store. Representative Dixon might be familiar with Keister's Hardware. You might remember Keister's. My dad was a manager at Keister's for pretty much my entire childhood. My mother, she didn't work. She dealt with severe mental illness. I like to imagine that if we're going to have a good benefit cliff calculator, that it could be usable for someone like my dad working a 10-hour retail shift, coming home to 3 very difficult children, including myself, and a mentally ill spouse. We need to make sure that this thing works for someone like that, because those are the conditions under which people will be utilizing this type of tool and making those types of decisions. A lot of the other benefit cliff calculators that are out there are great. They're great for researchers like me. I'm a PhD trained researcher. I can work my way through these tools and I can spend hours going through that. I think we need to make sure, though, that we have these tools that are truly accessible to working families, people that are under the types of pressures that we're talking about. So I think it needs to emphasize things such as user friendliness. It needs to clearly illustrate some of the pathways to self-sufficiency. It also needs to be integrated into tools that benefit recipients are already using. So in this case, for Kentucky, we need to make sure it's integrated with something like Connect instead of requiring them to go to other places. And then I also think we need to think about providing technical and coaching support services so people can process that information. And if they have questions, there needs to be a place they can go to ask questions as they utilize this tool and they make these decisions for the betterment of themselves and their family. Public-private partnerships, I think, is another model that we could consider. And this is a good way to help employers be part of this solution. And I think House Bill 499, which was sponsored by Representative Samara Heverin and passed by the General Assembly this past session, offers a viable framework to think about potential public-private partnerships. As a reminder on how that bill works, essentially, if you are an employer and you want to offer a form of childcare assistance to your employees, say, for example, a $200 stipend every month, assuming all program guidelines are met, the state can then step in and match that on a dollar-for-dollar basis up to 100% of the cost of care. So in that case, the state could step in and offer a $200 match, giving that employee a total $400 benefit that they can apply towards the cost of childcare. I think we can think about how this might intersect with benefit cliffs, and I'm going to use a very, very simplistic example, talking through the Child Care Assistance Program, or CCAP, where you could kind of just think about this theoretically, how it could work. But imagine, a single parent of just say a 2-year-old as an example, as they cross that threshold of 80% state median income. That's our current threshold for being eligible for the Child Care Assistance Partnership. When they cross that threshold, there's of course, there's a wait period that goes on there, but let's just kind of set that aside for a minute. Overall, they're looking at roughly a $5,616 loss when they cross that threshold in terms of their overall childcare benefits. And this is something just using the KY Stats Family Resource Stimulator. So it's about $468 a month. If that individual, though, is working for an employer that's an HB 499 employer, think about how that might work, where you have that $200 a month benefit from that employer, a $200 match from the state. That turns into just roughly a $68 a month loss for that particular worker. And just kind of calculate that ROI and that cost benefit from both the state's perspective and that individual's perspective. This is something that works out potentially really, really well. And the other thing that's great about House Bill 499 and something Representative Heverin was very intentional about is that state match continues phasing down as that worker makes more and more income. And so it really kind of creates this long transition period for them as that worker makes more and more money. The benefits that they rely on slowly decrease over time, as opposed to just falling off a cliff. Because you can imagine, an almost $6,000 loss, that's going to stop you in your tracks in terms of thinking about whether or not to accept a wage increase or more hours. I want to talk a little bit now about another program that Kentucky could give a lot of consideration into, which is something called the Earned Income Tax Credit. Tax credit, I know, can sometimes be a word with a lot of connotations in policy discussions around Frankfurt. One of the things I do want to emphasize with a tax credits work all sorts of different ways. We tend to think of them as creating things like tax loopholes or subsidizing X, Y, and Z, whatever that might be. Really, oftentimes you're talking about a tax credit, you're just using the revenue code to accomplish a policy objective. And I think the earned income tax credit is a really good example of just using the, something in this, like this, the IRS, for example, to accomplish a specific policy objective. The federal earned income tax credit is a tax credit program that targets specifically very low to moderately low income workers. It is a refundable tax credit. What that means is that if you are eligible for a credit that exceeds your actual income tax liability, you can recoup the rest of that in the form of a refund. So let's say I have a $100 refundable tax credit, but I have a $50 income tax liability. I could still receive that full $100. $50 would go towards the... Do we pause here? No. Oh, okay. All right. Thanks. Sure. The way that the EITC works, though, is that it is a credit that phases in as an individual makes more money. And to that extent, it serves as an incentive to work and bring in income. It levels out at a certain level as you bring in more income. And then the other nice thing about the federal earned income tax credit is that it slowly phases out over time. So you don't automatically just lose that. It's structured in a way that tends to favor tax filers who have children. That is a key component of this. I'm using 2020 data. The numbers currently are a little bit different because the monetary parameters of the earned income tax credit are indexed to inflation, so they go up over time. I use this one because there is a convenient chart available for this. But you can see here the spread. A filer with 3 children, for example, almost $7,000, whereas a non-parent, much lower. That's just the feature of that, and that's also been the source of some criticism with the earned income tax credit. But the real strength of it is that it phases in and phases out. Another downside to the earned income tax credit is that it's paid out in a lump sum after filing. So generally speaking, you file in January, you can't expect to receive an earned income tax credit till usually around March. So you get that all in one lump sum. With that being said, this is a program that has a very strong track record of incentivizing employment and also of being an instrument to help smooth out benefit cliffs. There's a lot of research backing that up. And another key feature that I point out with the earned income tax credit is that it's one of those policy devices that receives a lot of credit and a lot of attention, not only from left-leaning researchers, but also a lot of right-leaning researchers as well. It's one of those sort of ideologically bipartisan ideas. Just a good example of that, an economist that I look to a lot is Dr. Michael Strain. He's the director of economic policy studies at the American Enterprise Institute, which is one of the premier free market think tanks in Washington, D.C. He wrote about this in a paper recently, talking about how the earned income tax credit is the cornerstone anti-poverty policy for families with children in the United States, designed to fight poverty by encouraging and rewarding work. Decades of research on the EITC has found that the program meets its goals by increasing employment, in this case, among targeted women, and by successfully raising their annual incomes, lifting millions of families out of poverty. And the paper that they wrote confirms and extends that consensus. The program does, in particular, have a really strong track record of benefiting specific demographic groups, in particular single parents. It has been one of those things that has able to lift a lot of single parents out of poverty, put them into employment, and also help them deal with benefit cliff related issues. A couple things we could think about in Kentucky about how we might leverage the federal earned income tax credits. First, we could take a look at Kentucky's EITC utilization rates. Based on most recent data available, which is 2018, about 79.9% of eligible individuals in Kentucky for the federal earned income tax credit successfully claimed that credit, which means about another 20% or so out there who could have claimed it did not. IRS has done research on this. There's a whole bunch of different reasons as to why that happens, and we can talk about those momentarily. To put some real numbers on this, there's about 380,000 filers for a total of roughly $943 million that came into Kentucky as a result of their earned income tax credit. If we wanted to reach a 100% rate, that'd be about 475,000 filers to the tune of close to $1.78 billion. A 100% utilization rate is not realistic. We probably won't ever hit that. However, I don't think there's anything wrong with striving for increasing those utilization rates in Kentucky, given the positive impacts of an earned income tax credit. One of the things that we might consider based on examples in other states is engaging with the Cabinet for Health and Family Services to increase awareness of the earned income tax credit among benefit recipients. This is something other states have done. Maine, for example, works with their primary agency that's involved with administering benefits to raise awareness among some of their benefit recipients that, hey, you can access this program, walk them through the process. Something we could also do is engage our own Department of Revenue to increase awareness of the earned income tax credit among low to moderate income tax filers. The IRS actually has an earned income tax credit awareness day. I don't know how successful it is, but it's an example of some of the things you can do to raise awareness of that credit. Because again, claiming that is one of those things that can help a lot of these folks that are dealing with a benefit cliff related challenge. Another option, which I'm not going to lie, could be potentially more expensive than the other options, which I just mentioned, which would be low to no cost option, would be considering a state companion to the federal earned income tax credit. Roughly 28 states, give or take, offer a state level earned income tax credit that matches the federal earned income tax credit. The way they structure these is all over the place. There's a whole lot of different ways you can structure a state level earned income tax credit. Some of them are refundable, some of them are non-refundable, some of them primarily play the role of helping, filers who do not have children, making up that gap between filers with children versus filers without children. Some of them just sort of add on to the federal credit to make it more enticing. Something that in Kentucky we could kind of potentially play around with is if you take a look at maybe the areas where we phase out the federal earned income tax credit, you might consider a state earned income tax credit that sort of levels that out a little bit more, extends it out a little bit further. Again, because that's going to have the most impact on benefit cliff challenges. There's a whole bunch of different ways that you could structure a state level earned income tax credit. And so you don't really necessarily have to be confined by doing it any one way. The other nice thing about a state level earned income tax credit and the federal income tax credit for that matter is that as you think about benefit cliffs and all these different programs that we're talking about, whether it's Medicaid, SNAP, TANF, CCAP, housing subsidies, whatever it might be, it's going to be really difficult to come up with a one-size-fits-all solution to smooth out those benefit cliffs. An earned income tax credit is probably as close as you're going to be able to get to identifying something that could work with every single program. So that's just something to kind of think about in terms of what you might be able to do with an earned income tax credit. I want to talk a little bit about childcare now, and I'll try to move quickly here because I know the next panel is going to hit on this harder. So in terms of childcare and how it's intersecting with the workforce crisis, this is a major barrier to workforce participation as well as worker retention in a variety of different ways. And there's an abundance of data that can help us talk through this and understand that problem. Some quick polling from the Bipartisan Policy Center shows that upwards of one in five workers have actually left a job due to childcare related challenges. Some of the chamber's own survey data where we talked about employers about some of the key challenges that they're facing when it comes to workforce. 56% of employers that we've talked to mentioned that too many people in their region struggle with childcare issues that keep them from working. We can also look at Census Bureau data that gives us a rough ballpark of the exact number of people that might be out of the workforce due to childcare challenges, upwards of around 50,000. That's a pretty big number, given that that would be the difference in an entire percentage point, more than a full percentage point in our labor force participation rate. So 50,000 is a very, very sizable number. Employers are responding to this in a whole lot of different ways. We're seeing a lot more conversations about on-site childcare availability. Employers are pretty enthusiastic in exploring that. We're seeing a lot of partnerships with local centers, partnerships with CCR&Rs, so these are childcare resource and referral agencies. House Bill 499, I think, is going to be a big incentive for employers to be more engaged in this space. We're seeing things such as flexible scheduling, remote work. Something the chamber recently did was we released a series of childcare resources for Kentucky employers to consider utilizing to help them address childcare challenges for their workers. We released that last week, did a webinar on it yesterday, and that's responding in a lot of ways to questions that we're getting on a regular basis from employers. In terms of continuing challenges, childcare availability is really going to be the name of the game in a lot of ways. Affordability is a major issue. House Bill 499, again, I think takes a really great step in addressing that. But capacity, and I know the next panel is going to hit on that issue, but that really is a major issue. Unexpected closures, changes in hours, a lot of this comes down to childcare staffing. We're dealing with a statewide workforce crisis within the childcare sector. That workforce crisis is extremely severe and causing all sorts of havoc in terms of access to childcare. It's also a huge issue in terms of non-traditional work schedules. So if you're a second or third shift worker and you need to access childcare, it's going to be very, very, very difficult for you to do. And then, of course, things such as cost and also competition with other benefits. Childcare benefits is one type of employer-provided benefit. We also have healthcare benefits, retirement accounts, leave programs, education, tuition assistance. There's a whole range of different benefits, and some employers are finding that certain types of benefits work really well for the type of workforce they want to attract and retain. Other benefits don't work so well, and so those are things that will be calculated into an employer's decision-making process. In terms of policy considerations, we did package a list of recommendations for the Early Childhood Education Task Force to consider. I can send that to this task force as well, so that you all could be aware of some of those recommendations that we have. But this includes things such as stabilizing our child care assistance program, which is right now heavily propped up by federal relief dollars that are going to run out. So the state's going to need to think long and hard about how we come in and fill that gap when those federal dollars run out. Zoning is a big issue, can often be a barrier to expanding capacity to childcare. A lot of employers will get really excited about the idea of potentially offering on-site childcare, and then they find out that their land is not zoned for that. And they find out that they can't do that. And if any of you have ever gone through a zoning change at a local level, it can take upwards of a year or more. It could be a really big issue. There is a business partnership grants program operated by the Cabinet for Health and Family Services that helps incentivize employers to offer on-site childcare or become more engaged in that space. That's a great program that we're hoping to see expanded. There's the employer-provided childcare tax credit. That's a federal tax credit. That's another thing we might consider leveraging to increase access. And then, of course, addressing the childcare workforce crisis itself. That's going to be a major key issue to think through. So I know it's a lot of information there. I don't know how I did on time, but thank you all for hearing me out on that, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you for your presentation. Senator Wheeler has a question, I believe.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. All, I'm a fan of the Earned Income Tax Credit. I think it's a very good thing, as for the reasons that you've stated here today. I guess one concern I've had, and frankly, I've seen it from personal experience. I've had a sister that, had a substance abuse problem and living with a guy that really wasn't that great of a person, had 3 kids, and not that they're not smart. I mean, they learned to game the system pretty well. They would work until they figured out what they had to do to get to H&R Block, and it'd be a race to get the tax refund at the end of the year. And as a lawyer in a divorce practice, that's 99% of the time you'll see people fighting who gets to claim the refund. Has there been any look at maybe reforming it to where it's maybe more on a month-by-month basis, to where it and is paid out over time based upon maybe what they have done the previous year to encourage more sustainable long-term employment within the economy and make it kind of a continuous reward?
Yes. There's been a whole host of different reforms that have been considered to the Earned Income Tax Credit. I think the one that you just brought up is arguably one of the most important ones to consider, because as you said, a lot of people look at that as just a tax refund. It's a big lump sum that they get potentially a year out from when their earnings might change. And so that kind of changes perceptions of how that fits into an individual's larger income over time. It also doesn't help you if you have a mortgage payment due now, not next year. So I do think it would be very wise if we could figure out a way to allow for something like the Earned Income Tax Credit to be claimed at least on a quarterly basis. I think the federal government has experimented with this recently with the child tax credit. It was not the smoothest rollout because one of the things you saw happening is families claiming it and then finding out that they actually ended up not being eligible. And so when they did their filings the following year, they ended up owing some of that money back. I actually saw this happen with my brother. And I told him, it's like, you're not eligible for this thing, don't claim it. But he claimed it and then he owed it all back. And he's a whole other situation. But yes, I do think that that would be a wise way to structure that program. At the state level, there's nothing to stop you from doing that. Now, I think DOR would have to work really hard to figure out how to do it. And of course, as I mentioned before, a state income tax credit, depending on how you structure it, could be very, very expensive. But I think you're absolutely right. The other big reforms that have been mentioned with the Earned Income Tax Credit is whether or not how to handle childless filers. Should they have a lower rate than a significantly lower rate as they currently do and compared to filers with children. And that, again, I think reforming that tax credit has attracted a lot of bipartisan attention. Would not be surprised to see big changes to it within the next decade. because it is recognized as a valuable tool in regards to the types of issues that we're talking about.
Brief follow-up, if I may, Mr. Chairman. I think the other thing that, you notice as well is a lot of these people will run down to these quick tax preparation facilities, and they're kind of losing part of that advantage by getting that immediate refund. Sometimes, maybe 25, 30% of that benefit. And, if it was restructured, I think that, it could potentially provide more I think our goal in this committee is to try to find a way for the dignity of work and sustainable living. I mean, that's my goal on this committee, and I think childcare is definitely a part of that. But wages are something too. I mean, obviously, I guess there's a key of trying to find a way to increase wages without increasing inflation. I think, I think the last administration had a way to do that. This one really doesn't. There's also some good statistics that show, though, that having a parent at the home does provide for more sustainable mental health amongst children. I don't think that's something we want to lose in this conversation, that essentially forcing everybody in the workforce isn't necessarily a good thing. I mean, somebody, a parent at home providing, part of that child care themselves is a valuable thing in society.
Yeah. Yeah. And on that first point about sort of how people file, that does create a big issue, because they can lose some instances fairly large chunks of that potential refund. There are a lot of free filing services out there. I think I'll mention United Way one more time. I think they've worked in this space a lot. Certain cities work in that space where they offer free filing. I will say earned income tax credit, it's on the 1040. So whenever you're filing, you actually don't have to do a separate form to claim the earned income tax credit, but you do have to file. And that is arguably one of the biggest challenges that you run into, is that a lot of these folks that aren't claiming are probably not filing. And that's often where a lot of these individuals tend to lose out on it. So that's, again, another one of those reasons why raising more awareness of this credit, making sure that every low to moderate income worker in Kentucky is aware of it, and helping them understand how this fits into their larger financial situation, that's a really valuable thing that we might consider doing in Kentucky.
Thank you. Representative Bray.
Thank you, Charles. Your knowledge on this is probably deeper than anybody will talk to. But I do have a question. You may not be the person to answer this, but, kind of going back to your earlier example of, when you all were touring Kentucky, you had talked with people who had, couldn't take a raise because it was going to interfere with their benefits, particularly on the child care portion of it. Assuming that these workers have the best information to where they're making the best financial decision for their family, one of the things that I've seen and I've heard about is kind of the fear of, once they cross that threshold, they can't ever go back. Like, let's say something were to happen, they were to get laid off, they would lose that benefit into the future. What is there anything in place now to where they can, that safety net's still there, or how hard is that to cross back and forth on?
So I do believe some programs have lifetime caps. And so there might be certain types of programs where once you fully utilize it over time, you just flat out lose access to that. I don't think that's the norm amongst most type of benefit programs. I know Sarah Van over here might be able to talk specifically to CCAP, but to my knowledge, you can go back and reclaim CCAP if you have an income change. And of course, CCAP's a really important program to talk about in this, because that's your largest financial loss, oftentimes, with a benefit cliff. So I'm not aware of any sort of restriction that would keep you from going back to that benefit. So that might be another one of those places where it's kind of an awareness issue of letting folks know that once you step outside of this world of receiving benefits, you could probably go back to it if you need to. I mean, that social safety net doesn't just disappear. Now, with that being said, I do believe there are some programs that do have some lifetime caps, but that would apply. They would need to understand that applies regardless of whether or not they go into full-time employment, gainful employment, or not. That lifetime cap would still be there.
Okay. Thank you.
I have a couple of questions on this, and this may be a better question for our next speakers, but I'm going to start with you. And feel free to pass it on to them if you want. There's been a lot of studies that you've referenced here, and I know otherwise, about the impact of childcare needs on parents. But I imagine this is a case statewide, but I know it's a case in my more rural district where we don't have a lot of childcare centers. And those childcare burdens sometimes fall on parents or grandparents and great grandparents, many of whom are my age and are still in their earning cycle. Have we done anything to study the impact of grandparents staying home and keeping kids as opposed to working for their benefit? Because sometimes they've gotten another 20 years in the workforce.
So in other words, you're kind of looking at the impact on, say, like older workers.
Yes.
I don't know of any specific studies on that. I'd have to look a little bit at labor force participation for older workers, but I do think that problem makes a lot of sense to me, where you could have a lot of families where potentially there's upwards of 3 potential adult workers in that equation, where you have the 2 immediate parents and then a grandparent, and then ultimately that downward pressure on the labor force ends up falling on a grandparent. So I think that is a entirely realistic scenario. I don't know the scale of the impact. So for example, when we look at that, I mentioned that 45 to 50,000 number. A good chunk of those could very well be older workers. It could be folks that would be grandparents. I'd have to go look and see if there's an age distribution available for that, and I can look at that and see if that's an answerable question.
I can just see that they don't have as many immediate needs.
Yeah.
But at the same time, they're not getting an earned income tax credit for keeping their grandchildren or anything like that. But then they're compromising their financial security later on in life by not having enough money built up for retirement.
Yeah,
so that was kind
absolutely.
of the crux of my question. There's no need to turn to this slide, but the slide where you mentioned that there's a large gap in the number of job openings relative to unemployment, and it's a historically wide gap. Why is that?
Yeah, that's the $1 million question.
We'd
there.
win the Nobel Prize for economics if
Yeah.
you could answer that right now.
Our message on that is there's not going to be one factor that explains that. Retirements is going to be a really big one, though. There are a lot of people that have left the workforce, and there was a period of time in the sort of coming out of the pandemic where we had a lot of folks who retired and then were coming back. That has slowed down dramatically. So retirements is going to be a huge factor in that. You do still have, based on Census Bureau data, folks who don't want to come back into work due to issues related to the pandemic and the potential threats that the COVID might cause to their own personal health. That is something that still shows up. Going back to childcare, we have seen an enormous loss of childcare providers, not only in the state but nationwide. And that is another one of those factors that's going to put really significant downward pressure on labor force participation.
Was that COVID related, you think?
Oh, yeah.
They just went out of business then in the startup to get back in the game.
Absolutely. I mean, you think about sort of initially in this pandemic, those services suddenly became not as much needed because everybody was working from home or people were staying home, people lost their jobs. And that was a very difficult moment for a lot of childcare providers to weather, and a lot of them have closed. The other thing to keep in mind, though, childcare providers is we've been losing childcare providers for over a decade at this point. There's been significant decreases, I think, to the tune of 45 to 50% less today than what we had back in, say, 2012. So that's been an ongoing problem. So I think there's a multitude of factors that go into why we have such an enormous gap between the number of jobs that are available versus the number of individuals actively seeking work. And the chamber, the core message we've been talking about is making sure we're doing everything we can to remove potential barriers to work. The other thing to keep in mind, personal savings is still pretty high. Folks received a lot of federal stimulus, other forms of stimulus throughout the course of the year. We're still not paying student loans. I don't know if that's changing today or not. But that has, I think, enabled a lot of folks to be in a position to where it might be more financially viable than it used to not have to be actively seeking work. Mm-hmm. So again, multitude of factors, I think, bearing down on why that gap is so large.
A couple other questions on this. When you were talking about the average weekly hours and that increasing, there has to be some corresponding problems with this. I know I've had a lot of discussions with employers and employees and floor managers that are now working a lot of people 60 plus hours a week to keep production, because in their 450, 500 employee plant, they're down 180 workers. Are we seeing any problems, or is there any way to track the problems where people just, like for lack of a better way of putting it, get overwhelmed with the situation and being tired of working 7 days a week and missing out on some of their family life and everything? Are we seeing some retraction of our stable workforce because of the pressures we're putting on them?
Burnout is a major issue. And I think burnout is playing out in a number of different industries, but there's a lot of jobs that are open right now. And so if you're doing a job that you don't particularly like and you have marketable skills, you do not have to do that job anymore. You can very easily transition to another job opportunity where maybe compensation's better, or it's a different working condition. Maybe you don't want to work outside in 100-degree weather anymore. There's a lot of mobility. With that being said, we still do need those jobs that a lot of people might be moving away from. And so, yeah, I think burnout is a really key issue. And to kind of build on that point a little bit more, I think employers are responding to those labor force shortages in a whole bunch of different ways, not just by trying to increase productivity of the current workforce that they have. We are seeing some pretty strong survey data showing big increase in investments in automation and looking for ways to automate processes, which will have an effect in long term on things like workforce participation and the nature of jobs that currently exist. And a lot of that is, in a sense, being driven by just an inability to find workers. And so if you can find a way to automate that process or do without that particular worker, that's something a lot of employers are trying to figure out how to do right now with mixed degrees of success.
Obviously, as an employer, you'd much rather be fully staffed and not pay time and a half and double time. This appears to be an issue that leaving market forces themselves can't correct. Is there anything from a policy standpoint that we could look at doing to help this particular part of our workforce issue?
So in terms of getting, I guess, more folks into the labor force, is that kind of the broader question?
I don't know what I don't know on this. As far as helping employers, and it's almost like we're punishing good behavior. We're punishing the people that come to work every day, plus the days that they shouldn't have to come to work, or extending out shifts to cover and burning those people out, which is going to then hurt our businesses more, because they run the risk of losing their core cadre of really good employees in this process. And I just wonder I don't know what it would be, but is there anything from a policy standpoint? Because obviously the market left to itself isn't enough to fix this problem.
Yeah, I think what it comes down to is removing barriers for anybody who might be able to work, wants to work, and if there is something standing in their way that's preventing them from doing so, look at a policy remedy and see if that is something that policy can address. Childcare is going to be a big driver in that. So thinking through how can the state optimize its investments in childcare to increase capacity. We know that is something that will increase workforce participation. Substance use, that is having massive downward pressures on labor force participation in Kentucky. University of Kentucky did a study on this, estimating upwards of 50,000 people might be not participating in the workforce just because of opioid abuse, setting aside other forms of substances. Those are very real barriers to workforce participation that we kind of think about abstractly sometimes, but left unchecked, those types of issues will siphon more and more individuals out of the workforce. And when we have fewer people in the workforce, the folks that are participating, they are going to be under a lot of strain and anxiety, because employers are going to be trying to get as much out of them as they can. Now, they're going to be rewarding those folks that are participating in the workforce. We're seeing that right now with significant increases in compensation, benefit packages, and so on. But I really think it comes down to thinking through what are some of these barriers that people face to working, and what can we do from a policy perspective to remove those barriers and get those things out of the way so those people can actively participate in the workforce.
Something we talk about, our norm is a 40-hour work week, but it seems to be abnormal when we go this, because people are working 48 hours or 32 hours. to get your traditional average, but we're below that. Why do we have so many part-time workers in our workforce? Just for the reasons that we've discussed, or is there kind of a blend where there are just a lot of jobs that by their very nature are part-time? A lot of the childcare jobs I know are maybe not a full 40-hour a week childcare, just as an example.
Want to look in more detail as to, I don't know if Kentucky is exceptionally different in the number of part-time workers that we have versus full-time workers. I'd want to look at that a little bit more and see if there's good data on that. If you're going back to the average hours worked, that has been a long-term trend, that sort of 34 and a half hours on average. That's been that way for a long time. So I don't know if there's been anything that's changed significantly. So I think before I would offer an opinion on that, I'd want to see a little more if Kentucky is exceptional in any way in terms of maybe we rely more on part-time work versus full-time work. Obviously, when we dig into this issue, I think the charge of this task force does tie into that because right now we do see a desire on the part of employers to transition folks from part-time to full-time employment. This is at least one of those things, benefit cliffs, that is standing in the way of those transitions. As with everything, it's probably going to be a multitude of different factors. But I'd want to look into that a little more before I give you a harder answer.
You mentioned on moving past 85% of SMI that there was a waiting period, and you would address that later. What's the waiting period?
There's a transition period. Up until recently, I believe it was a 3-month transition period. Now it's a 6-month transition period, which is my understanding. So once you sort of pass that threshold, you don't immediately lose that benefit. You do have a bit of a transition. I think the thing with CCAP to think about is the financial loss is really, really big. And so for a lot of workers, they're not going to come up with an extra $5,000 or $6,000 within that 6-month period. So I think it's helpful. It gives them some time to adapt to that transition and to plan for it. But once that 6-month threshold is passed, I don't think they're suddenly going to find another $6,000 of income.
Sure.
However, again, if you go back to something like earned income tax credit, you can find $6,000 in an earned income tax credit. So that is one of those places, again, where I think that particular program can be real helpful for those types of families that are in those situations if they sort of understand that larger financial situation.
Kind of to Senator Wheeler's earlier point, this seems to be a cash flow issue for a lot of families as well. The graduated tax credit helps some, but it'd be nice to be able to spread the cash flow for earned income tax credit out over 12 months. There's no way for most families to prepare for a $6,000 loss on income on that. Following up on a wait period, we talked some right at the beginning of the questioning period about whether if an employee from Representative Bray's question, whether an employee that loses some income and falls back through that cliff, they could go back and be eligible for those benefits again, is what we think. Is there a waiting period for that before those benefits pick back up? Because then you have an employee that loses a significant amount of income for a job reason, and then there's a gap before those benefits. If there's a gap before those benefits come back into play, that can be overwhelming for a lot of our families' cash flow in their household budget.
If there's a weight gap, Sarah Vanover is the right person to answer that question. As someone who's managed that program.
Good job kicking that one.
Yeah, happy to do that.
Senator Wheeler has another.
Charles, have there been any? I mean, and I don't been any studies to show essentially maybe like what let's just say a family of 3, single parent with 2 children, what their average expenses are, and look at that, and you probably have to, tweak it down maybe by geographic region and cost of living to see what exactly, they need to live a average lifestyle, so to speak, if they're working, and kind of adjust that benefit figure to where if they get up to, let's just say it's $50,000. And she's got a job or he's got a job that's making $36,000, that there's a $24,000 worth of public assistance that they could get. Whereas if they move down, maybe adjusted on an annual basis to kind of get people to that sweet spot, so to speak. And I mean, it may be too complicated to get there. I don't know, but try to adjust these benefits to where there's just not a hard and fast cutoff that that it's something that would be flexible. A quarterly basis, annual basis to try to keep folks in the workforce. Reward them for working to get them to that spot. Not that necessarily they're going to be sitting at home drawing a check, but to get them to a spot to where they can live a moderately comfortable lifestyle with assistance of these programs.
So to the first question, yes, there's a lot of different tools you can look at. Things like cost of living calculators. A good benefit cliff calculator will have that factored into it. So going back to, say, KY Stats, Family Resource Simulator, they have a lot of that info built into it that I believe even gets down to county-specific levels. And a good benefit cliff calculator should be able to do that. And there's a number of different tools that you can utilize to estimate here's what a reasonable cost of living should be. Now, within all those, you and I could kind of poke through that because lifestyles are different, and we might disagree, but you can still average all of those things out to say, here's how much it costs to, live sustainably in this county at this time. So yes, that's all absolutely doable. I think one of the problems you all are going to run into, though, when it comes to doing things like smoothing out a benefit cliff and setting a lot of these parameters to where maybe they hit certain income levels, is a lot of that's going to fall outside the control of the General Assembly, because a good degree of it's going to be dictated by federal law and federal rules. And so that's going to be a very, very difficult thing when it comes to smoothing out these cliffs. And so some of the programs I think you'll have more flexibility with, others you'll have less flexibility. And so that's something that you'll have to think through quite a bit.
And believe me, I completely understand how difficult the federal government can be about some of this stuff. We're having that issue, and obviously we're going to be gaveling in at noon to address the flooding, and part of the problem is dredging the creeks. Well, the Corps of Engineers, through the Waters of the Americas Act, because there's some, crawdads or some Indiana bats, won't let you dig out the creeks, which would, provide for the free flow of water. So, I mean, I think that we've kind of lost the concept of federalism in the concept somewhat. So obviously it's going to take some work with our federal partners. But yes, I would be interested to see what can we do on a state level, to work with some of these programs to create, like you say, a flexible safety net system that allows people to kind of say not live their best lives, but live a sustainable life that helps to lift folks out of poverty in the long term.
And that is one of those places where kind of thinking through an earned income tax credit can be beneficial, because the other thing you have to deal with is, a lot of these programs are going to have different financial thresholds, and it's very hard to get all those to line up perfectly. Whereas something like an earned income tax credit can kind of step in and address everything at once if you structure it right. So that's another advantage to a tool like that.
Now, take one more question from Representative Dixon.
Mr. Chair, a statement, then a question, if I could.
Sure.
Charles, thank you so much for presenting today, and the benefits cliff calculator being brought up continually. I think that there's a wealth of information that with the calculator we can get in front of people that need that information. And even the last task force meeting and this task force meeting, it's kind of come in question forms, but is very true that there's a lot of programs that some folks may not know that they are able to access and they're able to use and would be very, very beneficial to them. But I do have a question on the tax credit, and I think you'd be able to hopefully advise us or answer this in the best way. But with the tax credit, great ideas and good purpose. As we as a state are looking at the income tax and phasing that out, we've aggressively made that turn and went to that to get it to zero. How does that look? That was a policy suggestion for you. So how does that look, or have you seen other states, or is there examples of, if that's an option to help now, how does that look as it gets to zero? Because eventually that option would run out.
Yeah, that's a phenomenal question. Short answer is you can absolutely still do it. The state of Washington, for example, that is a zero income tax state. They recently implemented an earned income tax credit. Key there is refundability, because obviously if you don't have a state income tax, you then have no state income tax liability against which to claim a credit. So that would also increase the value of that earned income tax credit quite a bit, because it would be 100% refundable. Everything would go. You're essentially just using the Department of Revenue to funnel cash to those particular workers. So it's absolutely still doable. I don't know how Washington has their set up specifically, but I know they are still using their revenue cabinet to administer it. You would essentially just work through them, do sort of like a fake filing almost, since you're technically not filing anything. So in other words, it's still very much doable. I would add to that, there's other states. Indiana has a state earned income tax credit. January 2023, Indiana will have a 2.99% individual income tax. They have a deep interest in phasing out their income tax as well. So other states are in this similar situation. It's 100% doable though. You could still absolutely implement some level of state earned income tax credit, even if you don't have an individual income tax.
Charles, thank you for your time today. We appreciate all your hard work in coming and presenting this, and thanks for your patience in working through a bunch of questions.
Thank you.
Next, we have some folks coming in on the childcare cliff effect. If y'all will come on up and introduce yourself for the record, please. And Benjamin, I'm doing that because I don't want to butcher your name, so I'm going to let you take the lead on that. Can I stop you for just a second? Make sure your microphone's on and kind of pull it up so everybody can hear better.
Is that a little better?
The green light on.
The
Green
green-
light is on, yeah.
No, it's not.
Okay.
There we go. How's that?
Yeah, that's better.
I'll do take two. How's that? I certainly want to thank you all this morning for this opportunity to sit before this august body. An honor and a privilege to be here, and happy to be here with my friends and colleagues. I also want to say thank you to our friend and colleague Charles from the Chamber, who preceded us. And now I'll pass it to our other two presenters here to introduce themselves as well.
Hello, I'm Dr. Sarah Vanover. I'm with Kentucky Youth Advocates, and I'm the Policy and Research Director.
Good morning. I'm Mandy Simpson, Chief Policy Officer with Metro United Way and Lead Advocate for United Way of Kentucky.
Very good. And my role here this morning is really to walk through a brief overview of childcare in Kentucky. What is it, and what are some of the major problems that are facing it? So you'll see before here on this slide an example of the three-legged stool of childcare offerings in Kentucky writ large. One, your mom and pop childcare center, the more commercial option. Number two, a family childcare home. This is childcare within a private residence, but still functions like a childcare center, although with a smaller ratio, but still following all of those health and safety regulations set forth by the state. The third is certainly a smaller option and is less often utilized throughout the Commonwealth, and that's regulated family, friend, and neighbor care, which is care from a family, friend, or a neighbor, but still adhering to those state rules and regulations as well. When we take a look at the availability of care throughout Kentucky, we'll see that we have just over 1,600 child care centers, and we'll see that those numbers begin to drop from there on to roughly 240 family child care homes, only about 38 family, friend, and neighbor care. And as we go down to the maximum amount of capacity in the state, we have a capacity of roughly 158,200 slots in those child care options. The important thing to remember is that capacity does not equal enrollment. While we may have the capacity for those children in those slots and availability for those working parents, that does not necessarily mean that there are 158,000 children in those seats currently, for a number of reasons that we will go through today. So first, and perhaps most jarring, I want us to take a look at the three graphics on the slide in front of us. Take a look at the center graphic. This is the cost for center-based infant care. $11,200. Compare that with the cost of public four-year university tuition at $10,700, and then compare that with the average annual mortgage payment of just over $1,300. Now, when we talk about a support like CCAP, it's important to remember that this is a support that is propping up numerous working parents throughout Kentucky, and largely from middle-class backgrounds. I don't know about you, but when I look at that middle number, $11,000 for center-based care for an infant, I can't afford that. Maybe some of you can afford that. That would be great. But when we talk about this support, it's important to remember that it's available for a wide range of Kentuckians. This graphic also helps to break down the cost of care in terms of percentages for both a child care center and that family child care home. We can see what percent of income is spent going down this list. If you take, for example, 2 children with a single parent, that's about 68% of that parent's income going for child care services. Also, when we take a look here at CCAP, there are a few important distinctions that I want to make. Number one, when we talk about CCAP, it is a workforce support. In order to receive CCAP, an eligible parent must be working, be in school, or actively looking for work. We like to say that childcare is the workforce behind the workforce. It enables working parents every single day to go out and be contributing members of this Commonwealth. When we also talk about that, it's important to remember that during the pandemic, for example, over 45% of parents in a statewide survey indicated that someone in the family had quit a job, did not take a job, or greatly changed their job due to child care issues. And since the pandemic, according to the Kentucky Chamber, over 100,000 Kentucky women have exited the workforce. Due to a difficulty in finding child care, parents experience an average of $3,350 per year in lost income, according to the Council for a Strong America, and that was pre-inflation. You also see a graphic here that runs down a little bit about what CCAP entails as far as the number of Kentuckians using it per year. One item that I want to highlight before each of you today is the problem of child care deserts throughout our state. This is an issue that many of you may be familiar with, but as we take a look at this map, it's important to note that most of our state, over half in fact, is what's considered to be a child care desert. And a child care desert is an area of the Commonwealth in which there are more children there than available child care slots. And a desert is classified as an area with 3 or more children per available slot. So as you take a look up there, you'll see which counties are impacted by that. But it's also important to note that even in Jefferson County, for example, that's not classified as a child care desert as a county, there are still urban and rural niches throughout the Commonwealth, parts of Jefferson County, for example, being an urban area, that still could be classified a child care desert. West Louisville, for example, falls into that category. One item that I want to tip you off to today is a coming survey that will touch on an item that Charles articulated quite well, and that's the coming post-ARPA cliff, those funds from the American Rescue Plan, those federal dollars that are due to run out here by the 2024 session, if not in the 2023 session. Those dollars went a long way into stabilizing the child care sector in the midst of the pandemic and beyond. Just some quick baseline data to share. We do have a survey of Fragile Ecosystem 4, which is a continuation of those surveys the Pritchard Committee and our team of statewide partners facilitated throughout the arc of the pandemic. Just to date, in this most recent survey that is still active, we've had over 480 responses from 75 Kentucky counties. 57% of respondents to date have said that they are not fully staffed. 70% said that they need to hire more staff to serve an additional 11 to 20 children. And most jarringly, 55%, so well over half of respondents to date, indicated that centers would now be closed without that federal stabilization funding, and how it was very well distributed from our state government. 70% indicated that they would have to raise cost, and 40% said that they would have to cut the wages of their child care center workers. So if I could go back briefly to this map, if something's not done to address this post-ARPA cliff, that map's going to get a lot worse. We're going to start to see child care centers dry up as if it is March the 13th, 2020. I'm going to pass things now to Dr. Vanover to share some additional information.
All right, I'm going to talk a little bit about the child care cliff for our families as well as the federal funding cliff that is coming. And then when you do have questions, as Charles indicated, I can help with questions on the child care assistance program as well. Right now, the average cost of child care in Kentucky is significant, but it does vary from urban to rural areas. Most expensive cost is infant and toddlers because our adult to child ratio is smaller there. An infant classroom in Kentucky may have 10 children at max, whereas a preschool classroom could have 24. Most centers lose money with infants and then gain back some of that with preschool. So this is the average cost, but these numbers were recorded in research from the University of Kentucky pre-pandemic, and there has been a significant inflation rate with these numbers in the past 3 years. So we're looking at average cost of an infant placement prior to the pandemic around $200 per week. So if you think of a family who is getting child care assistance, most families have a copay of some kind, so they look at the family's income level, and the closer that they get to the certification point, then they may have a larger copay, whereas families who have a higher poverty rate closer to the federal poverty line would may be covered completely. So in this example, we're looking at child care cost of an infant with the CCAP assistance. So the family may pay a $35 copay a week. Totaling for 4 weeks, which we're going to estimate at a month, would be about $140. Now, if that family were to have a wage increase at their annual renewal appointment and they say you no longer qualify for subsidy, they can go from paying $140 per month to paying $800 per month for that infant slot, with a $660 increase within a very short amount of time. I know that for me, in a middle-class family, that would be extremely hard to navigate, and for some of our lower-income families, that can be nearly impossible, causing the families to either have to consider leaving the workforce, or maybe for a preschool-age child, school-age child, leaving that child at home alone when they're not equipped to deal with that decision. Now, Charles mentioned the transition plan that was put into effect during the pandemic. This is a transition plan out of the Child Care Assistance Program. So taking that time period, the federal government requires with the subsidy program that families have 12-month eligibility. So they qualify, and then they have 12 months that they stay on the program, and then they come back in to requalify based on their current income level. At the time of the reauthorization visit, if the family is no longer eligible, then they would have a 6-month window where they would get 50% of the CCAP income over that 6-month time period. So they may go from paying the $140 a month to $400 a month for those 6 months, and then eventually to the $800. And that helps ease the process out. But inevitably, over a 7-month time period, they've had an increase of $660. The other cliff that we would like to describe is the funding cliff that is coming up from the federal funds. So just with the American Rescue Plan, the state of Kentucky was given $763 million. Now that was designated into 2 specific buckets. The largest portion, $470 million, was to be given to the providers in sustainability payments. We had child care providers that were 2 to 3 months behind on their mortgage, that had bills, significant bills that they had to pay back. They had taken out small business loans, and when you have a margin of almost no profit, you don't have a way that you can pay a new loan payment every month. So a lot of providers had to do back payment with that, and then they used additional funding to help supplement the income. Child care providers right now are really struggling to compete with the retail industry and the hospitality industry, because all of those, if you're working at Arby's, your wages might start at $15 an hour now. Child care in Kentucky has always hovered close to minimum wage in a lot of programs. And we've tried to stimulate those wages up to $10 an hour or even $13 an hour for a very hardworking group of individuals. But it's still a very low-income job. Now, go back for just a second. Thank you. The second pot of money was flexible funding, and it lasts a little bit longer. It's $293 million. The largest portion of that was used to help the Child Care Assistance Program. And there are different ways that it's been used, along with increasing eligibility. So initially, prior to the pandemic, you had to be at 160% of the federal poverty level to qualify. In 2 different stages, the cabinet moved that up to 200% of the federal poverty level and now to 85% of the state median income level to qualify. We also opened, we've also increased the reimbursement, let me say that. Initially, that was much lower, and now we're covering up to 85% of the cost of, and that's not 85% of the cost of care, but 85% of the programs in the state we pay the full amount for. So some programs are still have an overage because they might be much more expensive than the norm. But if you're on subsidy, 85% of the programs you can access and be able to use your subsidy to cover the full cost, possibly with a copay, but still a much greater access issue because many of our families had very limited access to high quality programs. You can go ahead. So when we initially got these funds, there were a lot of questions about how the state would handle the funds, what type of plan would be able to access, and what would happen afterwards. The crux of the issue is that stimulating the wages was necessary because the other industries were also stimulating wages. If retail industries were going up in costs, if grocery stores were paying more, if fast food restaurants were paying more, we had to pay our child care providers more because this is the industry that supports all other industries. As far as the amount of funds that Kentucky received, we are actually at a state-by-state level doing much better than some states in these darker shades that will have a significant cliff that they may not be able to recover from. However, if you look at Kentucky individually, go ahead and click, please. You see how much we got typically from the federal government on an annual basis through the Child Care and Development Block Grant every year, how much we got with the federal funds, and what we're going to return to by 2024 on our typical annual funds from the Child Care and Development Block Grant. So we received over $1 billion basically in a 2.5-year time period. Those are going to be phasing out in September 2023 and September 2024 at the end of those federal fiscal years. And then as those funds fade out, as Ben said, there are centers that are significantly worried about what they're going to have to do to stay open. The consequences of losing that cliff funding from the federal government is including programs that won't be able to keep their wages. And if child care programs decrease their wages, I guarantee you that fast food restaurants, groceries, retail stores are not going to decrease theirs because they have to keep those in place to keep workers. We'll see programs that have to make a really hard choice in reducing staff wages, dramatically increasing wages that families may not be able to afford, or close. And so there will be a drastic decrease in childcare. Like Ben said, the map of the childcare deserts could vary quite a bit after that point. And parents then will have to make a really hard decision about whether I stay in the workforce or whether I stay home. I mean, as it is, a working parent, I have 2 young boys. I had an infant and a toddler at the same time. That year, I paid $18,000 in child care. Many working parents, particularly working moms, have to make the decision if I'm paying this much per month, if I'm paying over $1,000 a month and I only bring home an extra $100, an extra $200, is it worth it to be apart from my child that time and pay all that? Some families are only working because they need health insurance. So they basically turn their paycheck around to childcare, but they're worried about what happens if they lose health insurance. And others just say, you know, it isn't worth it. I'm going to go ahead and stay home, but then feel a great deal of guilt that they're not contributing to the family income. And then there's a tough choice too. If you are a working professional mother or a working professional father, if you leave the field and you come back 6 years later, where will your job be? You won't be at the level when you left. You're starting all over in the workforce, and that can have a long-term effect on your family. So these are all hard decisions that parents are faced with. And then, as we saw in the pandemic, when a lot of childcare programs closed, there are a lot of families that can't afford the childcare and may be leaving children home alone that do not have the ability and the maturity yet to make hard decisions if they're in an emergency situation. And that can respond to child protective service issues and whether or not the child is actually safe to be left at home alone.
So that is a concerning forecast, but I do want to wrap us up today with some really solutions-oriented considerations because there is a path forward here. And as I walk through these, you will see strong alignment between what we are recommending, what the chamber is recommending, and that really affirms the consensus that folks viewing this issue from all perspectives, families, providers, workforce, really have achieved in discussing what might put us in a better place and lead us to having a childcare sector that can in fact grow to meet the demands of our labor force and our families with young children. So first on this list would be sustaining the really important improvements made to the childcare assistance program with the federal funding that came through the federal aid packages and was directed specifically towards childcare. Dr. Vanover hit most of these improvements, so I'll just reference them at a high level, but increasing eligibility. And just for some context, that went from pre-pandemic to 160% FPL, which is about $45,000 for a family of four, to 85% of state median income, which is a little more than $66,000 for a family of four. Now, this brings us closer, but not all the way, to recognizing that way too many Kentucky families are vulnerable to the cost of childcare, and too many kitchen table calculations are not adding up to the opportunity to participate in the workforce if that is what's best for the family, the parent, and their children. But Senator Howell, as you referenced earlier, eligibility does not equal access. Childcare providers must be able to afford offering the child care assistance program seats so that families can bring their child into them. And key to that is the reimbursement rate that the state pays to providers. Dr. Vanover mentioned pre-pandemic, our reimbursement rate was actually so low in Kentucky that we were at risk of federal corrective action. And it certainly was not working to grow capacity within the program or the child care sector. We're in a much better place now, that 80% of market rate reimbursement, but we still aren't quite to even covering the cost of care, much less the cost of quality care, which is what we actually want to be talking about, because we want to be talking about building bright futures across two generations. So while parents are thriving at work, children can be thriving in their early learning environment. Another would be that transition period that both Dr. All and Dr. Vanover mentioned. Again, that's a 50% payment of what you were receiving in CCAP for a 6-month period. That does give some time for families to take a new look at their financial picture, to hopefully amass some savings, and to get closer to being able to independently cover the cost of tuition. This also checks a box for us for a federal requirement that we have some cliff effect mitigation mechanism, because as you've seen illustrated, if we do not have something like that in place, it's a pretty vertical drop in the child care assistance program particularly. I also want to talk about categorical eligibility. What we've found that was perhaps ironic but not surprising is one of the industries that had the toughest time actually increasing wages because workers were so concerned, and the reality for them would have been that they lost their child care benefits, was childcare. So even as there was the incentive to increase wages as a result of the sustainability payments, many childcare teachers themselves could not take advantage of those additional and much needed resources because of the hit to their childcare assistance. So categorical eligibility, which will soon be in place through the Division of Child Care and with federal funds, will allow all child care teachers to be eligible for the child care assistance program so that they could take a modest raise, maybe to $10, maybe to $13, and still have their child's seat covered in child care by CCAP. It's also beneficial for the providers because providers work very hard to give some discounted rate to their employees, but that means they're eating that cost, and their margins truly don't allow them to do that without even more significant financial risk. So maintaining categorical eligibility for childcare educators themselves will be critical. These are also, I would say, maintaining categorical eligibility is in context a very minimal investment, but very critical, noting that we need to do something to mitigate the staffing crisis in childcare. Unfortunately, categorical eligibility alone will not do the trick for overcoming what we really need to, as we see in the childcare workforce. So the median annual income for a childcare teacher in Kentucky is just north of $22,000 a year. And candidly, it's laughable to suggest that that can compete with retail or hospitality. There is even a joke about it. Why did the childcare educator cross the road? To get to her second job. Because almost 20% of our childcare teachers in Kentucky, including those who are working full-time, must have a second job just to make ends meet in their own home. So you've heard the work of the Early Childhood Task Force that's working in parallel reference today. They're going to be digging in very significantly to what we need to do to be able to shore up wages and benefits for childcare educators. And we hope that this committee will consider those recommendations in the context of their conversations as well. Because as Ben began to illustrate with the results of our survey data, I did some quick back of my notebook math to suggest that if we've got 70% of those 485 providers responding to say that they need between 11 and 20 staff members, even if they could only serve 11 more children, that's 3,734 more children we could be serving right now with existing license capacity that we can't because we do not have enough educators. To build upon that, we did a survey in Jefferson County of just 108 childcare providers who were short 613 staff members that, if they could hire, would open seats for more than 6,500 children. Those numbers are easy for me to remember because they both start with 6, but also because they are astronomical in the number of seats we cannot open to families right now because we do not have the staff to do it. So it really is going to take a robust and thoughtful and strategic optimization of investment to ensure that we have wages and benefits that can support our early childhood educators. I would also just note finally, and you heard about this as well from Dr. All, but ensuring the success of the Employee Child Care Assistance Partnership, which was established through Representative Heveron's House Bill 499 in this past session, that does have the opportunity to provide a really important bridge. Perhaps even more importantly, it's bringing private sector resources into childcare for the first time in a truly meaningful way. And all stakeholders here must have some skin in the game as we're talking about the sector that's critical for all of us in our economy to thrive. So we are watching closely as those regulations are written and implemented, and hope that employers can feel the confidence they need in structuring their benefits program to align with this opportunity. And with that, I will conclude and open for questions.
Thank you very much. Thanks to all of you for your presentations. I believe Representative Bray has a question.
Sure. Thank you all. So since March 2020, do you all have data on how many child care centers have closed?
We lost approximately 9% of the child care centers and family child care homes in the state of Kentucky. Now, that number does not indicate the spots. The capacity prior to the pandemic was 165,314. We have decreased to 158,000, just a little over that. However, again, like Ben said, that doesn't indicate actual enrollment. Every time a center has to close a classroom because they don't have enough staff, that shortens up the number of children that can be served. And almost every center I know has at least one classroom closed due to lack of staffing. So that number could be considerably lower. The capacity is based on the physical space that the building will allow for the children to be served, but the shortage of teachers is putting a much larger burden on the ability for us to serve the maximum number of children in the state.
Okay. May I follow up? And then you had talked about, once the kind of the federal money starts slowing down and drying up, because that you anticipate more closures. Mm-hmm. Do you have any kind of estimates or data on that?
Not at this point. I think the survey that Ben talked about will give us some indication. Initially at the beginning of the pandemic, centers themselves anticipated up to 40% would close. Mm-hmm. There were many states that had much greater losses than Kentucky. I mean, more programs closed in California than Kentucky had open to begin with. And so some of that has to do with how the cabinet spent the money. There was a dual effort both to support centers with continued investments to supplement their income, as well as long-term efforts that were one-time payments like scholarships, grants to open new programs, things of that nature. So that combination is going to benefit Kentucky more than other states who might not have used the same type of package. It really is going to depend on many factors, including what kind of investment we give long-term. Many states are using programs like staff supplemental wages. If a program meets a certain amount of quality, they may supplement that center specifically for additional wages to go in, because ultimately this is human capital that we're dealing with. The reason you go to childcare is because of the teachers, and no parent leaves their child somewhere where they don't feel safe and they don't feel like the teachers love them. So if we don't have high quality teachers, then we won't have childcare programs. And if we don't pay them higher, then they won't continue to be open. That's kind of the general idea. But access is also an issue where those programs are that close. If they're in higher populated areas, if the centers that are open continue to close additional classrooms because they don't have staff. So due to the variable amount of factors involved, it's hard to have a concrete prediction on what those numbers could look like. But I can tell you, after several meetings in DC with a large number of states to talk about what we're all facing, every state is facing the same kind of issues. These are not isolated to Kentucky, and all of it is related to staffing and how we care for our child care providers so that they will stay in the field.
And then just one follow-up statement, if that's okay. So I come from a rural county where we have been blessed with, an abundance of child care facilities. But one of the things I have personally noticed, and then in talking with a lot of these child care facilities, was, for the 4 months that they were mandated to shut down, they couldn't recover. And that's led to a lot of closures. And that's, not only were some of those draconian, measures hurtful at that time, they're hurtful now as well, because as jobs are becoming available, we're still seeing that child care shortage and that child care expense going up because, it's a supply and demand economy. And so that, the mandated closures is something that we're going to be struggling with from here on out, I'm afraid. And these 9% of facilities that have closed, that didn't just happen in a vacuum. That was, let's be honest, that was mandated. So
one of the issues that surrounds that, you said it's supply and demand. And in most businesses, I'm going to say that supply and demand is accurate. If you have a need for more shoes in a community, then the shoe store is going to open because they can make money. The problem is that child care programs don't make money. So there can be a huge need, but a supply and demand economy doesn't work, because if you're going to open a business, invest your life savings in it, and then lose money, it makes it very hard to want to open that business even though there is a demand. The programs in Kentucky that are more financially stable have some kind of additional backing that goes along with that, whether a university backs them, a hospital backs them, they are a partnership with Head Start and get federal funds. They're programs like Toyota where somebody takes the loss because it's a business investment for their employees. But there is a loss in childcare no matter who runs the business, and we have to figure out who takes the loss.
No, you're absolutely right. And when I was mentioning supply and demand, the demand for these vacancies, the demand for these spots is driving up costs.
Yes. Because
there's so much competition for them. And then, you're exactly right. If, somebody's not associated with a larger facility or a hospital or university, they can't compete. Because, there's a shortage of, in all the committees I'm on, I hear about shortage in public workers, shortage in police, shortage in fire, shortage in nurses, shortage in teachers. It's across the board. And child care is not exempt from that. And you're exactly right. You're the program that feeds, that frees up workers to be available to work. But because of the increase in cost from a lot of these closures, it's something that's going to be with us for a while.
I would also just note that, as you did, Representative Bray, that the impacts from the pandemic compounded existing fractures within the childcare sector. Kentucky had lost 45% of its childcare sector from 2013 to before the pandemic started. So we were already truly experiencing a childcare crisis. And then we faced mandated closures, additional health and safety costs, the challenges of parents feeling safe to bring their children back to childcare, and of course, the wage competition that steeply compounded the challenges within the childcare labor force itself. So we've been in crisis for a long time. Now it is just a crisis that is impacting every other industry as well.
Yeah, thank you, Chair Dixon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A couple questions, if I may. Thank you guys for presenting so much. A couple questions I have. One, and you kind of highlighted and touched on it just then with the 2013 data. We have that, and there is a task force that's on early childhood, but I would assume that there is data over the past 10 years of, this number, this 11,200, where that is now versus where it was in 13, the cost of actually, enrolling your child and keeping your child in child care. And then I would also assume there would be data of what the cost to those child care centers has been from that time frame on. And I think if that data is available, I think it would be good data, to kind of correlate those two to see what's going on there. And I'm probably stating the obvious by saying that it's been looked at. But the question I have, and I kind of prior to that statement was, so correct me if I'm wrong. In 2020, we had 165,000 and some change enrolled children in child care enrolled in Kentucky. Is
We
that
had
correct?
the capacity to enroll
Capacity,
165.
the capacity. And then now we're at 158 of capacity. So with that, it's kind of a two question. One, we had a huge influx of money that's went into the system. I mean, $1 billion. Have wages of those providers went up?
Okay, so when we got the stabilization payments, that 470 million, the federal government gave us specifics on that has to go towards centers. Now, at the time that we received that, a lot of our centers were down 3 and 4 months on their bills. However, we structured that, the cabinet structured it in a tiered system. So everybody was going to get money based on capacity over like a 1.5 year stretch, 9 payments that would go out to keep the centers afloat. But we did it to incentivize wages. So the first tier was a base payment on capacity regardless of what you paid your staff. The second tier was based on capacity, but you would pay your staff, all staff, not just teachers, anybody who worked in that facility, a minimum wage of $10 an hour, and you would get 10% more than the first tier out of the stabilization payments. And then there was a third tier paying staff a minimum of $13 an hour, where you would get an incentive of 20% more than the base pay. So all child care programs applied for those different tiers. The largest tier that people applied for was tier 2 at a base pay of $10 an hour. And there was a fair amount that, less than a third of the programs, but still a decent amount that applied for tier 3. The idea was that it would encourage programs to raise their wages while still paying those back bills. And there was a good amount of feedback that, hey, I'm trying to do this. I'm making sure that everybody starts at this pay. I'm making sure that everybody starts at this pay. So we were seeing increase in wages. However, some centers they were so far behind at that point that they didn't feel like they had the security to increase the wages. Plus, they were significantly concerned about what happened in September 2023 when those stabilization payments were gone. So maybe they kept closer to minimum wage, but they gave stipends for a bonus. Overall, we have seen an increase, but with increased pay, again, it's directly contingent on cost. The stabilization payments allowed for the costs not to increase significantly yet, but we will see those costs increase or wages decrease and staff leave the field as we wait for that funding cliff to hit.
And I think the reason I kind of said that statement is I think it is a wages raise. We've had enrollment drop, and there's a place I'm going with that. But a statement to that, I think that we're going to run into another issue as those wages raise, like you had brought up initially in your presentation, that you end up with individuals who are on the cliff of what this task force is actually about. So it kind of ties one and hand in hand with an issue that's being seen on the cliff side, but then an issue. Now we're back to the employee or the individual. regulations
There are quite a few, yes.
is, that's a big discussion. But my question is if money and wages have decreased capacity in the state, what is there a target regulation or regulations that you see? Is the red tape what's getting in the way of our child care centers and them being able to grow and develop? Because we've seen a huge influx of money, we've seen some wages go up, but we're not seeing an expansion, of these child care centers. Is regulation in the state what holding that back?
The regulations within Kentucky, most of them are based on the federal requirements. Kentucky's child care regulations are much lower in requirement than many other states in the U.S. One of the hallmarks of safety, basic bare bones safety in regulations is the adult, how many children one adult can take care of at one time. Kentucky has some of the highest ratio. It has the highest ratio to any state in our area. So if you look at any state that touches us, in Kentucky, one adult can be left alone with 10 2-year-olds to care for them throughout the day. I do not want to be that one adult left alone. I've done it because I've had that job before. But basically, all you have time to do is change diapers and try and prevent children from biting each other. There's not a quality component when you do that. If Kentucky were to take away some of the health and safety factors that we have in place, I can foresee a significant increase in injury and the spread of illness in our centers because we are behind in a lot of the areas that other states have improved their health and safety requirements as far as the bare minimum. Now, there are some federal regulations that we have no control over in order to get the child care block development funds. So that's not something that Kentucky waivers on, or they could lose the $90 million plus per year that is granted to the state as the child care lead agency.
I would say there are some strategies we have seen that are increasing the workforce and the capacity of childcare sectors in other states. And those include things like strategic wage supplementation that has really truly allowed for better recruitment and retention of childcare educators, cost for reimbursement rates not based on a market that is not a market, but on the true cost of care. These are strategies that we have seen actually increase the supply of childcare to better meet the demands of workforce. So that's what we really want to zero in on to optimize investment here in the Commonwealth.
Yeah. And I would also like to add that there's been a bevy of research done that shows that when it comes to early childhood education, low quality or poor quality early childhood education can actually be damaging in the life of a young child. When it comes to access to early education, quality is really key, as Dr. Vanover stressed, in terms of health and safety, but also in early brain development. We have studies that show that low quality early education has actually harmed children over the course of their long-term social, emotional, and educational development. And that is certainly a road that we do not want to go down in this Commonwealth.
No, I appreciate that, and I may clarify if I may. I know Charles had brought up in his presentation previously about some of the local regulations and employers not being able to open up child care centers of their own. And I probably should have been a little more specific in guiding. That was a great answer and got us some answers. But, I guess that would be, kind of the question is do you see those local requirements and those local regulations standing in the way of employers and individuals opening up filling the gap of the...
There are significant issues with zoning laws in local communities that are preventing family child care homes. The idea of a family child care home is that it is in a residential area. It is much like the child's personal home. It's a small capacity. It's not a storefront business. And there are efforts that have been made, particularly in a bill that Senator Carroll passed 2 years ago, that we need all of our local areas to look at their zoning laws. Jefferson County made huge efforts this past year about changing their zoning laws so that more family child care homes can open, despite the fact that they are a business in a residential area. And those family child care homes are typically where we see second and third shift care, weekend care, more flexible care in rural areas that might not fit a center. And Mandy can speak more about Jefferson County, I know.
Just to speak to the scope of what sort of bricks of this barrier were in place around zoning in Jefferson County. Prior to the changes made this year, 60% of Jefferson County strictly prohibited childcare for more than 6 children, even in a family childcare home, which could be regulated license type 2 up to 12 children. And it prohibited the operation of childcare in industrial zones. So now there are at least paths forward. There are some additional checks and balance in place to maintain neighborhood integrity as well as health and safety of children. But there's at least the option to be using our land in a way that allows childcare to exist where parents live and work. So zoning looks different across every single county in Kentucky, but I do think there are best practices and models that can be brought forward to show how you create zoning that it has the best opportunity to build additional childcare.
Yeah, and I certainly want to applaud the model that Mandy and Metro United Way have worked on in Jefferson County. I had the pleasure of working on this planning and zoning issue with family childcare homes in the 2021 legislative session. We need to make it possible for all counties in Kentucky, all 120, to get past those burdensome planning and zoning laws, particularly for family childcare homes. We ran into steep opposition with that during that session. But we think that what Jefferson County has developed, if that were statewide, we could see the wide-scale growth of the family child care home within local residential neighborhoods that are closer to parents, closer to kids, and that's a great opportunity to rapidly expand the amount of capacity and enrollment that we would see for child care across the state. So take a look at what they've worked on. In Jefferson, it's very impressive. Let's find a way to make that statewide.
Thank you. I have just a couple of follow-up questions. I don't remember who mentioned this, but somebody mentioned that the average child care provider worker makes roughly $22,000 a year. How many hours? What's that break down to?
Dr. Vanderver may be able to speak to this even better than I can, but I think for most providers, the majority of their teachers are working full-time. Now, they may also have some teachers who are potentially in college, who are working part-time shifts, but the majority are working full-time, and child care providers typically operate almost a 12-hour shift. So
I was going to say, that was my follow-up question. What's full-time? Because I know a lot of it's 6 to 6, and I love my children dearly, but I'd lose my mind if I had my own 3 kids for 12 hours straight.
A 40-hour work week is typical with child care providers for full-time, but I will say that since the pandemic, there are a lot of programs that since they have not been able to find enough staff, they could be working open to close in a 6 to 6 program. The estimates of those average wages are based on full-time workers. You also have to remember that in a child care program, somebody who's working full-time probably doesn't have health insurance, may not have paid time off. So that $22,000 a year does not typically include a benefit package. It's just the $22,000.
How does that stack up to neighboring states? Has there been any cross analysis for how we stack up as some of our surrounding states?
You have to look at the cost of living in the state. But I will say that in states where their subsidy reimbursement is higher, where the state puts in more than the mandatory state match for the federal funds, then the wages do increase in that. And we've seen great things in states like North Carolina where they do have a wage supplement program in order to, the higher quality of the program, the more additional wage supplements can get. And that program designates that the money must go to wage supplements instead of the owner of the program using it in optional ways. But the states that we see have the highest payment are states like New Mexico, where they have very high subsidy reimbursement rates.
And going back to an earlier question that I asked Charles, is there been any studies on the impact of other family caregivers that pull themselves out of the workforce full or part-time? Has there been any studies on that and what the economic impact is of that? I know Mandy's shaking her head then and now, so maybe I'll direct that toward you or whoever.
What I can tell you about is that it varies a lot based on how the grandparents or the other family member have gotten custody of that child. So if the child is in established kinship care through the state, then children who are part of kinship care, fictive kin, things like that, can qualify for subsidy assistance. And that can be a huge support. We've had grandparents that are raising the children through kinship care, and a lot of the federal funds target supporting children in foster care and kinship care is a high priority group. So those funds can go to assist them. Another option that grandparents may have is that if they are a family friend or neighbor, they can get a background check and become part of the family friend or neighbor care program, and then they can get reimbursed for watching the child if they are not the child's primary residence. So if a child may live with the parent, but the grandparent really carries the burden of a lot of the cost of raising the child, then they could become a regulated child care provider as a family member and get some level of reimbursement for watching the child. So there are options that could support a grandparent, aunt, or uncle if they are doing a large portion of the child care or if they become the primary caregiver.
Thank you. Anybody else have any questions on that? All right. We really appreciate your hard work and preparing for today and your time coming up here to talk to us about it. And if that kind of wraps up our questions on that, thank you for your time. And